Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francescagraham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners, to another fantastic episode of the Star Chamber, where we discuss administrative processes inside the U.S. government that have a uniquely terrible way of harming American citizens, completely absent any concept of due process, which is...
Take that, China, Russia, hackers, and terrorists.
Exactly, exactly. So on our podcast today, we have a fantastic guest. His name is Erhan Bedestani. Let me just read a quick biography of Erhan. So he retired from the active duty Army in 2023 after 21 years of service. He earned his law degree from Columbus School of Law, Catholic University of America in May of 2023. He is the executive director of Warrior Family Advocacy, a nonprofit he started in 2022 to conceptualize, define, and generate solutions to the problems veterans and service members face in family court with regards to custody arrangements. While in service and since retiring, Erhan continues to be motivated to help ease the pain and suffering of so many veterans and service members have faced at the hands of a family court system they feel is predisposed to view them as unfit parents for no reason other than their service affiliation. His passion project is to research and publish on this issue in an effort to create increased awareness and education on the topic. Erhan is above all else a proud father to a 15-year-old son, with whom he moved a total of 4 times while in the Army before settling down and retiring from active duty service in Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to the show, Erhan.
Impressive. Wow.
Yeah,
no,
pretty
it's great
awesome
to be here.
And correct me if I'm wrong, while you were in the Army, you were a Special Forces soldier, correct?
I was, yeah. I did most of my time in the Army as a Green Beret with 10th Special Forces Group, and then transitioned to Foreign Area Officer with a focus on Europe, and did a little bit of a stint at State Department. And that was actually where I had a pretty good schedule, and that's what allowed me to go to evening law school at Catholic University. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Wow. All right, impressive.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, like, the bio focused on what you've been doing after the Army, but I wanted to make sure all our listeners knew just how cool you were in the Army as well. I mean,
Oh man, back in the day,
Special Forces,
Yeah, Joe right there.
You were
I was something else, man. This is the point where my son says, "Dad, stop."
Yeah, exactly. You used to be cool, man. All right, so before we get started into the content of today's show, I just want to read our quick disclaimer. So the opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as an official stance of any military or government organization. All right, so you guys are all probably wondering, why do we have this guy on our podcast whose bio really talked a lot about family law? Well, if you recall, back to July 6, 2024, Erhan and I co-authored an article about this funky little thing relevant to uniformed service members in the DoD, Department of Defense, and the Coast Guard, called How to Lose Your Children, DoD Style in 1, 2, 3. It was a great article. Family Advocacy Program, Administrative Proceedings, and Their Potentially Devastating Outcomes. So just to kind of get us started, I'm going to read the first paragraph of that article just to kind of give an overview. And actually, for all of our listeners, you might not know this. How did we learn about this idea called the Star Chamber, which is the Star Chamber podcast? It was from this article. Erhan taught us about it. This thing called the Star Chamber. Fantastic. So,
Awesome. Full circle. I love
full
it.
circle, right? So, first paragraph of this article. Did you know the DoD's Family Advocacy Program Incident Determination Committee, IDC, administrative hearings can result in a service member losing custody of their children in civil court and or being involuntarily separated from the military with an other than honorable discharge. These outcomes are the result of proceedings that lack even a basic semblance of due process for either the alleged victim or the alleged offenders. While the hearings were originally intended to assess clinical treatment needs of alleged victims of emotional and or physical abuse, they have morphed into semi-criminal hearings chaired by clinical technicians that carry lifelong negative implications. Pretty scary stuff. So, Erhan, briefly describe for us, please, what is this funky little thing called a family advocacy program?
So the family advocacy program conceptually is supposed to help family members of service members and service members themselves if they're dealing with issues of child abuse or domestic violence, interpersonal violence.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be the service member themselves that is experiencing the violence. It could be their child, or it could be the spouse or girlfriend of the service member. So conceptually, it's designed to help identify when a service member walks in and says, hey, look, I'm dealing with this dynamic. It could be emotional abuse, it could be physical abuse. Let's get you the help that you need. Okay, let's put you on a treatment plan. Let's try to bring the alleged abuser in as well, and let's try to formulate a plan here to create safety, to create stability, and a long-term plan. That's conceptually what it is.
And so it's supposed to, correct me if I'm wrong, it almost goes hand in hand where it's the clinical portion of full care, and then you also have the criminal portion, which CID or Criminal Investigative Services, those types of organizations would handle, while the FAP is designed to handle the clinical portion. Is that fair to say?
Well, FAP really up front is designed to handle clinical issues, right? And then if you did have an encounter on a military base or involving a military service member where there is an alleged abuse of a partner, of a child, yes, CID could get involved, the local jurisdiction where you live. You know, if we're at Fort Carson, Colorado, it could be El Paso County and the police there. So there are angles, or I should say, other organizations that are invested in doing that process, in investigating, rendering a charge, and then, you know, the prosecutor bringing charges. So you can have that both through the Army CID process as well as through the local jurisdiction. With FAP, if they take an allegation of abuse, emotional or physical, depending on what their review of it is, they can then transfer it to an incident determination committee. And we'll talk about this. This is the subcomponent, the hearing component of it, where you will have members from CID, the Judge Advocate Corps, and this multi-member panel of 9 personnel that will render a decision of substantiating or not substantiating the claim of abuse. And that's when things get really scary, is when you find yourself now in the IDC, the Incident Determination Committee. It used to be called the Case Review Committee. They change the name every few years, but conceptually, how the IDC or CRC runs is the same across all the services. And the procedural due process risks that exist are also the same across the services.
So, great segue. So can you describe the IDC for us, the Incident Determination Committee? So you said it's made up of 9 members. What does it actually do? Why does it convene? How long does it convene? Who are the members that sit on it? Do the accused and the victim have a chance to be inside of those hearings? Is it how people would, all of the older members of our audience who are Perry Mason fans, Ryan, I know you're a Perry Mason fan.
I was more a murder she wrote, but yes.
Oh, also good. Also very good. So is it the way that our people who are listening to the show conceptualize like an actual court hearing where, you have adversarial system, victims there, sub offenders there, et cetera. So could you describe it a little bit more?
Yeah, Francesca, that's a great question. And no, it doesn't have an adversarial system, which is one of the big issues with the Family Advocacy Program Incident Determination Committee. So, look, what's going to happen is a service member or a spouse is going to go and make an allegation. The allegation can consist of alleging physical abuse or emotional abuse. The definitions for those are pretty substantial for both, right? Something like potentially withholding funds from a spouse can be considered emotional abuse, right? Grabbing somebody's arm could be considered domestic violence, physical abuse, right? So context is everything. Long story short, when you go to a FAP, a family advocacy program installation on any of our bases, right? Basically, they are located at every major military installation. You will go and you'll say, look, I'd like to lodge a FAP allegation. All right. My spouse, service member spouse, or my, non-military spouse, they have said things to me which are emotionally traumatizing. The FAP licensed clinical social worker is going to take in that allegation. And then depending on their discretion of that allegation, they're going to say, look, this warrants being brought before an incident determination committee. Once the allegation is made, they in essence become a fact finder, but because they're a licensed clinical social worker, they're bonded to the alleged victim, right? They're trying to render clinical services immediately to the alleged victim, get them on their way. But now they're also having to do an investigative role, which means reaching out to the other side, so the alleged abuser, right? And so the system already starts to break down right there. And a lot of the issues that we see, and we'll get into in more detail, a lot of this stuff boils down to he said, she said. And it gets very, very difficult to start determining what actually happened. And so a lot of times, what the licensed clinical social worker has to go off of is the allegation and then the alleged abuser saying it didn't happen. It's very, very hard. It takes a lot of training, and even for those that are trained, to determine which allegations are true and which allegations are false. But nonetheless, it does seem like, the benefit of the doubt is going to go to the alleged victim. And so a lot of times you have cases that
they're the first.
Yeah, they're the first to report.
They're the first to report. And so now, if the social worker's done their initial fact finding, they say, okay, now it's going to an IDC. What does that look like?
At the IDC, that fact finder, that licensed clinical social worker, is a non-voting member. That's a recent change. They used to be a voting member, and they would present the evidence that they have found in their interview with the alleged victim and their interview with the alleged offender, right? And there are no rules of evidence that we're familiar with in our adversarial system. And so back to that point, there are no attorneys that are present for either side, for the alleged victim or the alleged abuser. There is actually no evidentiary file that is made public, at least to those that are involved. So the alleged victim and the alleged offender never have whatever the body of evidence is that the licensed clinical social worker has compiled. So you really don't know. I mean, I was a judicial law clerk for a year at Montgomery County Circuit Court. And let me assure you, in a criminal case or a civil case, the evidence that is admitted, right, that forms the only evidence that is allowed from which the judge or the jury can make a determination. And let me assure you, everybody from the prosecutorial side and the defense side knows what that evidence is. There's an issue that somebody doesn't have access to evidence that is ultimately what the jury or the judge is going to make a decision from. That's a mistrial.
Absolutely.
So basically, this IDC circumvents any semblance of due process as we Americans would know it, Sixth Amendment, Brady rights, et cetera. Is that what I'm hearing?
100%. And a segue is the most similar framework to the family advocacy program IDC that existed but no longer exists because civil libertarians were so up in arms about it and demanded change, were the Title IX hearing processes occurring on college campuses. These are sexual harassment cases. The FAP, Family Advocacy Program Incident Determination Committee, as it stands now, is still the structure of the Title IX process on college campuses that came under such significant scrutiny that under Betsy DeVos back in 2020, the Department of Education launched an investigation and went through a notice and comment period to fix the procedural due process issues that were occurring in Title IX hearings, right? Conceptually, a good system. We have sexual assault or abuse on a college campus. We're going to have colleges create incident determination committee where the allegation is reviewed. But again, that process for a number of years between the mid 2000s all the way to 2020 didn't have access for the attorneys. There was no cross-examination of the parties. You weren't privy to the evidentiary file. And a lot of those cases built up over the late 2019, 2020, 2021, and made it to respective state Supreme Courts and determined that colleges were not adhering to fundamental procedural due process mechanisms and had violated the constitutional rights of the alleged offenders, many of whom were never found guilty in a criminal court, but found to have substantiated allegations through this internal college Title IX hearing process, which is still very similar here in the IDC. It's actually an exact replica. Title IX has since changed. That hearing process has changed, and students are afforded considerably more due process. There's considerable more transparency. So that system has matured because of the scrutiny and the review that society as a whole has put on it, because we've got a lot of parents with kids in college, all right? And college is a big deal. But the military and the FAP IDC, it affects such a small population. And the information flow about these procedural due process issues just have not elevated to the top. Our joint article, right, and the platform that you guys have, Walk the Talk Foundation, has enabled at least some semblance of understanding to a larger community about what's going on in the incident determination committees. It's a travesty. And really, our push needs to be, look, if we could change the Title IX hearing processes on college campuses, we can change the FAP IDC hearing process. And mind you, 20 years ago, the DoD reviewed this process, and its own internal review came back and said, let's provide clinical support, but we got to get out of the IDC game. This is dangerous. This is bad. Not because alleged offenders are not getting due process. Not just that, okay? Because we don't even think the alleged victims are invested in the process and feel like they're getting a fair shake. And so really, there's no trust in the system from either side, alleged victim or alleged abuser. And we're dealing in things that there's already structures for.
So I want to turn back onto what you were just now saying, the results that come out of the incident determination hearing. What could those results possibly be? And how could those affect both uniformed service members, and we'll get to this a little bit later, to civilians who are also associated with the military?
Yeah, so when the Incident Determination Committee convenes, it's going to convene on allegations of emotional or physical abuse, and or both, depending on what the allegation is. A lot of times you'll see both as part of the allegation. Sometimes you'll see one or the other. Bottom line, though, at some point a determination is made, and the determination is made with use of one term. It's either substantiated or it's not substantiated. So it's not saying guilty, it's not saying innocent, but substantiated is equivalent to guilty, and not substantiated is equivalent to not guilty. So you find yourself after a family advocacy program IDC dealing with a substantiated allegation, what do you do? And what are the impacts? The impacts depends on, is it an emotional abuse allegation or is it a physical abuse allegation? If it's physical abuse, the stakes are very, very high, extremely high. Physical abuse allegation can lead to administrative separation from the Army. There is a Lautenberg Amendment, which was passed, which means if you are found guilty of domestic violence, you cannot possess a firearm. So if you're in the military and not being able to do anything related to a weapon means you can't do your job. And so a lot of chains of command can use that and will, and a lot of times are left with no other viable option than to seek the separation of the service member administratively. So that's one very most dangerous course of action or scenario, I should say. If it's emotional abuse allegation, depending on what that allegation is and how your chain of command wants to deal with that, depends. I mean, some may say, look, just go through whatever the family advocacy program's recommended treatment plan is for that. A lot of times it's treatment associated with things like power differentials and power dynamics and getting, so many treatments under your belt. That could be what you have to do, but that's on the emotional abuse allegation side. Physical abuse, there could probably be some training as well that you have to go through. But again, whether or not you complete the steps that they require for you after the finding of physical abuse allegation being substantiated, it likely is not going to be enough to keep you in service. Then let's move from service to civilian sector. A substantiated allegation or even finding yourself under a family advocacy program allegation is going to have a significant impact if you're going through a family court matter. So let's say you're in the midst of a divorce, or let's say you're wanting to relook something like your parenting plan. You're divorced and you've had a parenting arrangement for, a number of years. I assure you that the opposite party is going to leverage that FAP Incident Determination Committee finding for every ounce to get full custody of the child or children and, use it to create this specter that domestic violence was a key component, either emotional or physical abuse within the framework of the relationship. The risk there is, as we discussed before, the scrutiny. The scrutiny within the IDC is a preponderance of the information standard. It's lower than a preponderance of the evidence standard, which basically means, is it potentially likely that this happened?
Oh, wow.
I mean,
oh man,
And from the military service member, there's already a certain amount of bias that service members are more aggressive, more type A, toxic male, et cetera, potentially. I mean, that is a known bias.
Francesca, that's a fact. That's an absolute fact.
Right.
There's a Cohen Veterans Media Group that every year does an annual survey. Most Americans, 2/3 of Americans think that if you're a veteran or a service member, you have PTSD. 2/3 of Americans think that. That means,
and PTSD specifically that could lead you to some sort of violent
that's right.
outburst.
And then 1 in 4 Americans believes that PTSD manifests itself violently.
Right.
So bottom line up front, those numbers are completely wrong. It's not the normal manifestation of PTSD. Number one, maybe 1 in 11 service members has PTSD. And then those that manifest their PTSD in some kind of aggressive fashion, it's not PTSD that's the determinant of that, right? It's, did they have previous antisocial behavior? Did they have an issue with drinking and alcohol before? And those are generally the same kind of trends to indicate if somebody's going to have antisocial behavior or be a risk in a relationship or the parent. But having a PTSD diagnosis in and of itself, there is no correlation. But But the brains of Americans across the country, including those that work at FAP, have been hijacked by this narrative of maladapted veteran. They all watched Rambo way too much, and the stuff that's coming out of the media even today, when it's explaining the story of a veteran, is coming at it from an extreme. It's either the extreme hero who single-handedly saved the unit from being overrun, right? Or the guy who comes back and goes crazy and falls off of, the radar and does something, cataclysmic. It's crazy, but this is the way that the media has set it up, and that lack of connection to military, where less than 1% is the population, it's very easy for the media narrative to fill the void, and that's what's going on. That's the civil military gap in an information context about what the veteran experience is, and that feeds into this stuff.
Can we talk real quick about potential solutions? So I think, Francesca and I, we hammer on the inordinate amount of deference that our congressional and judiciary branches give the executive branch, specifically the Department of Defense. So all this deference, like, well, whatever you guys decide, it must be good and true and just and accurate and all of that. And I am a fan of legal stuff. I'm not a lawyer, just stayed at a Holiday Inn last night. So I ask you this, Erhan, is with the repealing of Chevron, which is, as I understand it, which afforded a lot of latitude to the various departments and branches in administrative processes, when that was repealed, that took some of that power away. Is there hope that the DoD will follow suit or have to be more checked and balanced, or there be more scrutiny? And is this part of the solution? And what's the rest of the solution? Long question there, sorry.
Yeah, Ryan, it's a great question. So to your point, Chevron deference is dead. Long live Chevron deference, some would say, but others are saying, thank God it is gone. The importance of Chevron deference was, for a number of years, it allowed the government to be very lazy with implementation of administrative processes where the law passed by Congress left a gap. And so if there's a gap, and they say, well, they didn't really tell us what the tax should be, but we're going to go ahead and determine we think it should be 5% because, well, that's what our analysis says, right? Back in the day, somebody else could say, look, I'm being impacted by that tax. I don't see how you can give me a 5% tax. It actually doesn't make sense. And let me tell you all of these rational ways as to why it doesn't make sense. And the court, all the way up to the Supreme Court, would say, well, Chevron deference, it is the government. They probably know what they're doing. Bottom line up front, Chevron deference was decaying for a number of years. And two of our Supreme Court justices, Judge Kavanaugh and Judge Gorsuch, were never big fans of Chevron deference. Judge Gorsuch himself, his mom had worked at the EPA as a senior administrator under the Reagan administration and had sought to very much use her position to mitigate the administrative state that was going on. She was eventually forced out. It left a significant gap in Gorsuch, feeling that his mother had resigned and somehow said, mea culpa, when in reality should have pushed for this continued mitigation of the administration state. Obviously, it took much longer than the 80s, but eventually that's where we're there now. And so when Chevron came down, obviously Gorsuch and Judge Kavanaugh were two strong proponents for that. What that means for FAP and the IDC is, look, the legislation that required the establishment of a family advocacy program, do you think it explicitly wrote that there needs to be a FAP IDC, or do you think that was not stated? What do you think?
Clearly not stated.
Not stated.
Creative license, I'm sure.
That's right. So I think when you get to your question, how is it to be fought on this angle of attack? It means we've got to find a group of cases, or even one case, that we're willing to take all the way up to the Supreme Court and highlight that the deference to the Department of Defense through the legislation in which a family advocacy program was created, that this is not in line with what Congress had intended. Okay, and then we show all of the unintended consequences and specifically the procedural due process issues. So that would be one line of attack. The other way to solve the issue would be, okay, look, DoD, taking care of families is important, right? I agree with that. I think taking care of families is important. Having a method for somebody on an installation to report these issues is important. Okay, well then let's add procedural due process mechanisms that don't exist. So let's keep it, but make it better. Okay, that's option two. So you don't get rid of it, but you establish processes akin to the changes they did with Title IX back in 2020 on college campuses and those hearings. And you can even the playing field so that both parties feel like they're being heard and they're getting a fair shake, right? So I think those are really the two kind of primary ways that we can advocate for change here. The third one is informing the body of family law practice that's out there, and this goes to the child custody impact that this has, you know, understanding the framework under which FAP operates so that, look, you're not going to be able to get rid of somebody bringing before a family court judge the fact that the other party has a FAP allegation or a substantiated allegation. It's going to be admitted into evidence, 100%. What you can do is mitigate the strength of that evidence because you're informed by the discussions that we're having here and doing some research about all the procedural due process issues and saying, look, there's no evidentiary standard and there's very little scrutiny. And so any allegation really where a person can say it forcefully is more likely to be approved and substantiated than not, even if there's very little evidence. And even, a civil jurisdiction would not have taken the case, right? So that's how you mitigate it. But the only way attorneys are going to be informed and empowered to do that and help a service member that's dealing with an IDC substantiated claim in family court is to go after it like that until we get rid of the program, or like we said, we institute procedural due process protections that currently don't exist. But your point, Ryan, about Chevron deference is really a good one. And I think that is the line of attack that we would need to take, that I would recommend taking. So really right now, as I go through, publishing, like I did in Family Court Review 2 years ago in my Legal Law Review Journal, and then another publication coming up in the Military Law Review that specifically compares Title IX to FAP, I'm trying to build a groundswell to say, let's take this to the Supreme Court. We're ready. Let's do it. And so what I'm hoping this platform does in this conversation today is you guys have worked with a lot of great legal minds on issues of administrative systems in the Army that don't afford procedural due process. I want to link in with them and say, let's figure out what the legal strategy is going to be, because I think Chevron deference and ultimately the end of Chevron, I should say, presents a very unique and prime opportunity to get justice, I think, for a lot of service members. Because what we haven't said outright right now is it is the stress of this system itself that is breaking families. It is the stress of this system, which is resulting in service member suicides. I cannot tell you how many calls I have fielded from a service member calling me and saying, I think I'm at the end of my rope. I can't.
Well, I'll tell you how many. It's a stat we quote quite often, 29%. That's the number or percentage of suicides of active duty members, at least, that were involved in some ongoing administrative or legal process. Almost a third of suicides from calendar year 23 involve this. So the threat is real, and it's statistically proven.
Brian, I appreciate you saying that, because I think what we realize in talking to the community here that's under the juggernaut of these administrative processes is it's not the conflicts overseas, right, and trauma associated with that they're dealing with. They were trained and ready to deal with that enemy and that threat in that way. They do not know how to handle the fact that the service that they have given their life to all of a sudden turns around and is prosecuting them. And not only prosecuting them, but in a manner that doesn't give them a fair fight. That becomes wholly destabilizing to the service member. And so, we've got to correct that. If we're serious about getting after veteran suicide, we've got to get serious about this issue. And you guys really are one of the sole proponents of that. I can't applaud you enough. Francesca?
Yeah, Well, I was going to say three things that you've been talking about. That kind of three big points that have stood out to me as we're getting ready to wrap up are that the same things, and we see this a lot in the whistleblower community, the same things that make you cool, the fact that you're special forces, you're F-16 pilot, you're a jump master, I've just described some of our big things here just with this little audience. The same things that make you cool, if you're not under scrutiny, at the point that you become under scrutiny, all of a sudden make you the enemy, difficult to deal with, hard-headed, stubborn, inflexible, all these types of things. So it's just it's a
Yeah.
very interesting dynamic that you see within family advocacy court as well as family advocacy, IDC court, as well as within whistleblower situations. The second,
Exacerbated by the fact that we were all trained to win, right? So
correct,
when we become under
correct.
scrutiny, obviously we're going to be the boat rockers because that's exactly how we were trained to be, right?
It
Never accept defeat.
Yeah, Ryan,
exactly. And
Francesca, Ryan, it's dead on. I think when a service member finds their integrity questioned in this way, it's a button, it's pushed, and part of
Mhm.
the information that we need to get out and kind of managing those that are going through this is, look, everything that you would do as a service member, don't do it. Like, take the chill pill and operate in a different way. You've got to find a different gear to address your issue, because when you come after it in the way that you were naturally predisposed to do it, right? Confront it, be aggressive about taking down that threat. All it
You're
does,
you're now the
you're
enemy.
just amplifying all of the bias and the stereotype and the stigma
Right.
that the other side is already using, and weaponizing against you. And so part of it is you've got to find a different gear and a bit of a different persona when you're managing these things.
And the second major thing that I wanted to just make sure we highlight during this discussion for all of our Poindexters out there, Ryan, we forgot to say suck at point. I just realized we forgot to say suck at Poindexters
All
after the
right. Well,
disclaimer.
still, you still suck it. That's still a
Right,
blanket,
still suck
a
at
briefing
Poindexter.
there. All
The
you
other,
Poindexters out there.
right, the other big thing I want to make sure that's clear for all of our listeners is that we're not saying that the creation of family advocacy was just a way to unfairly target service members or their spouses. It was filling a very definite gap. It was designed to fill a gap. We agree with that. We understand that family members were lacking certain rights and certain privileges that they should have had. And so FAP was filling a gap. The issue that we have, however, is not with FAP itself as a concept. It's with this Incident Determination Committee that is completely lacking in due process. And so the third major point that I just wanted to bring forward is maybe one of our last points before we get ready to close out. So if you go to the article that Erhan and I jointly published in July 2024, item number 8 for issues with this is an alleged offender is allowed, and when I say offender, I'm talking both a uniformed service member as well as a civilian spouse associated with the military. And that's significant because people ask, well, why does FAP have jurisdiction over civilians? Well, because jurisdiction is even a question, because we're talking about administrative process, not illegal.
Scary.
It's scary, right?
Scary.
So an alleged offender, military or civilian spouse, is allowed to request reconsideration of an IDC finding if they can prove the quote, IDC did not have all relevant information when it made its finding, or quote, the IDC did not follow published Department of the Army or Navy, whatever, policy. A tough standard to meet when the alleged offender, again, civilian or military, has no idea of the evidence presented and no record of the hearing to reference, because we haven't covered that. They don't actually keep a record of the hearing, right? So on that note, Irhan, closing comments
Man.
as we close out this show that is the Star Chamber of the Department of
Oh
Defense.
You
man.
did it. You did a
Wow.
great job. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest star chamber issues. The the manual that addresses how one can seek a reconsideration, and you get two reconsiderations, right? The first hearing, you can request an appeal or a reconsideration, and then the third reconsideration is your last, right? That's it.
Hmm.
The chips fall where they do. You're done. You've got to stick with it. But they say you've got to address an issue during the incident determination committee. How can one do that if they're not party to the event. It's crazy.
They're not allowed.
They're not
They're
allowed.
not allowed to be in a
They're
room.
not allowed to be in the room, nor is an attorney for them allowed to be in the room. So it just
Right.
doesn't make sense. Number two,
Mm-hmm.
if there's a procedural issue with how the IDC was run, well, how am I going to know there was a procedural issue? One, I'm not a procedural expert. Okay, an attorney would be, and they would be able to identify that. They're not allowed in there. But even if I educated myself on what the procedures were, I'm not in there. Okay, so again, both basically are non-starters, if you will, in seeking a reconsideration. I mean, how does one even put together a valid argument, right? Or say, hey, you guys didn't have this piece of information, and I think maybe it wasn't in the file that I've never seen of information that was presented by the licensed clinical social worker. I think.
And you can FOIA, but you'll never get, because we have clients who FOIA'd and have never actually received any of the information.
But I'll assure you, the only way that you can get through this process potentially unscathed is you've got to get an attorney. You've got to get an attorney, and you've got to get an attorney immediately. Because what a lot of service members do, or civilian spouses, is they believe that the system is going to take care of them.
Trust the process.
And the process
Yep, they
is
trust
not
the process,
your friend.
foolishly.
The process is not your friend. And if anything, information that you give openly and in trust and think that it's actually helping your situation will be turned around and used against you. I mean, look, when I was at Georgetown Law for a student event, when I was applying there, they had a very notable defense attorney. And he said, if you're guilty, get a lawyer. If you're innocent, you definitely get a lawyer. Okay? Because at the end of the day, systems operate off of different metrics. And sometimes getting the guy or getting the gal is all that matters. And it doesn't matter if it's the right girl or the right gal. And, the CDC, the Case Determination Committee, now the IDC, or Case Review Committee, I should say, CRC or IDC, a lot of times their metric for success is, how many substantiated claims they can make, right? And so there's a mission creep that's going on here too, and we have to be aware of that. A system only continues and only grows if it can find more issues that it needs to be involved in. And so the IDC is a real growth out of a FAP program that was, designed to give clinical help. Now it's rendering legal-like decisions with longstanding ramifications. It's mission creep at its worst. And the people that are involved in the IDC process and at FAP, they're not legal experts. They have no idea what procedural due process is. But most dangerously, they think that they do. And that's the other problem, okay? Because they got a 30-minute slideshow on it. All of a sudden, they know what evidence is. And look, I mean, we've been in.
Sounds familiar somehow.
We've been in the military long enough to know that, you take people that are not experts and put them in some very, very specific situations that require expertise. The FAP IDC is the same way. And it's never the same group. It's never the same people that are there. So there's a lot of room for improvement.
And last comment, I know I said that a second ago, but actual last comment. For those of you who are wondering, anybody off the street can go to FAP or give a phone call to FAP if they're not allowed onto the military base because they don't have the right credentials, and make a complaint against either a uniformed service member or a spouse within the Department of Defense or the Coast Guard. And that can kick off for that person one of the most hellish, long life impacting, life, liberty, property, etc. processes that person will ever have experienced.
Incredible.
As an example, we have a person that we're talking with, a civilian spouse, who was a social worker and is now no longer able to practice as a social worker because of a finding against her in the FAP process, and she's trying to contest, but she has obviously no access to the evidence. So how is she going to contest it? Life, liberty, and loss of real property. That's significant.
Yeah, that's the liberty interest, and that's constitutionally protected. And unless we can get senior leaders at DoD to relook the IDC, people's liberty interest is being crushed, because it's their reputation, it's their career, it is their ability to find equitable employment after, and it is literally cutting off the parent-child relationship for a lot of service members as well. That's also constitutionally protected. So there's a lot of issues here that we can get after. And hopefully this podcast today starts a synergy with others that are looking at the administrative hearings and systems in DoD that need a fix.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate it, Erhan. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Great discussion. That was awesome.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion. And I look forward to continuing this fight with you.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your week.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.